What I'm going to try to do in our time together is speak to you wearing two hats. One as a researcher, as a scholar of the movement, as I look at it analytically and critically, but also as a participant in the movement. So you'll see me move in and out of these two different modalities or ways of speaking. So what are we going to talk about? So this is the point at which you laugh. Religious humor is allowed. So here are my talking points. So Oxford University Press, who published the book that Tom so kindly referred to, began asking me, is something going on? And many of you began saying, well, it's been about 10 years now. Is this movement, what's new? What's going on? Is it running out of gas? Is it going away? And if it has changed, well, how has it changed? And what might we do to think about it? And as I began studying that, and with the help of some friends in this room, we've put together a new version of this book, a new and revised edition, which will be coming out later this year, we hope. And I'll be addressing what's different, what's new, and answering all these questions. So tonight what I hope to do is give you a short snapshot or window into some of the things which have changed in the movement over the past decade. And to some extent, you're part of those changes, and they may seem normal to you because you are indeed part of them. And I'll break these factors into internal and external factors. But briefly, first, it's awfully hot. Let me get this off and become a little bit cooler. Let me set the context with two things. So one is what my day job is. I work at Princeton University and run a research center, and this is our mission here. It's to conduct research into faith and work, developing theoretical frameworks and practical resources for leaders in the marketplace. So I tend to focus on the leadership community, but much of what we discover through our research is applicable to any and all people in the movement. Major, do we have the slides up, or how does that work? There we are. So let's jump in. The second thing I wanted to tell you, because this will set the stage for some of the things that we'll be talking about tomorrow morning in a workshop, and might give you some language and vocabulary. Those of you who are newer to this Faith at Work movement, going, well, what is it even as a movement? What's it about? One of my colleagues, Nico, is here. Nico, would you stand so I can give a little shout out? Nico Letta has joined our team at Princeton about 2 years ago. She comes from Romania, schooled in Switzerland, Paris, all over, and has a PhD in economics, but has also read theology. And she is helping me refine this tip scale. It's like a Myers-Briggs, if you will, except for faith at work. How do we bring our faith to work? And there's 4 E's. There's 4 components to it. And you might sit and think, what is your natural predisposition? How do you, when you think about bringing your faith to work or living out your faith at work, well, what's that mean? That's the big question a lot of people have. And there tend to be 4 different ways my research has found. First, one is ethics, our personal ethics, but also the ethics of our organization. So my personal probity and how well my organization is as far as its social consciousness and justice and things like that. The second is what I call experience. Its meaning, its purpose, its calling. Do you experience your job as something with potential holy significance? Or is it just a job to pay the rent? Which still is not bad, but do you imbue it, or do you discover it has meaning and purpose? And many people view their work as a calling, no matter what that line of work might be. The third is expression. How do you express your faith at work? And that has verbal and non-verbal ways. Some people might think out of the Christian tradition of evangelism as a synonym, but I prefer using the word expression. And the fourth and final way is enrichment. And by that, I mean, sometimes work is brutal. It's tough. It's nasty. Someone steals credit for your work. You get fired or laid off through no fault of your own. You were promised something, it didn't materialize. And for many people, their faith is the balm in Gilead. It's how they keep going. It's how they get up in the morning to go to a job that they maybe don't really like that much. So this sense of enrichment, that faith can enrich someone's work life. It's the person who might pray before a meeting, things like that. So I put this out now, not to go into any more detail, but to think of some of the people. If I go to, say, a dinner party or a cocktail party or a barbecue or something, and people say, what do you do? And I say, I'm in the God business. And they look at me like I'm strange. But then I say, well, I'm interested in faith and work, or spirituality and work. And people will often say, oh, you mean proselytizing, don't you? I say, well, no, it's a little bit more interesting and complex than that. So these four modes, I want to, for those of you who are new to this faith at work phenomena, I want you to think widely and also deeply about what faith at work might look like. All these are biblically sound, theologically robust, and very much a part of the Christian tradition. By the way, most of my remarks today will be focusing on the Christian tradition, although some of what I say is applicable, frankly, to any and all traditions. So that's a bit of a setup to think about how you might think about in all the programs and breakouts and things you do today, these 4 E's, or TIP, the integration profile. So here is briefly what the first version of the book was about, as a primer, if you will. I'll summarize just a few things. And one is that, by the way, my acronym, FAW, stands for Faith at Work. And so Faith at Work, first of all, I was just about finished with the book, and one of my colleagues, Professor Withnow, said, well, David, that's really interesting, but are you sure it's a movement? You keep saying it's a movement. Maybe it's just a fad, a flash in the pan. It's this year's version of Pet Rocks, for those of you who are old enough to remember those. And that set my research back about 3 or 4 months to gather data and understand, well, what constitutes a social movement? The civil rights movement, the women's movement, LGBTQ movement. What constitutes a social movement? And there's 3 basic criteria, and this meets all of those criteria. One of which is it has an organizing principle, a driving organizing principle, something that motivates people to do it. And the motivating factor that I identified is people have a deep yearning to live a holistic life, might be some of the jargon we would hear people say. They want to live an integrated life. They don't want to have to park their soul in the car before they go into the office. Indeed, as one of my friends, I'm doing a project with a company in Silicon Valley, and they said, you know, if I could bring my dog to work, which you can in Silicon Valley, why can't I bring my faith to work? So it is a movement, and movements last a long time. They're not ephemeral. They have and they have the potential to influence society for the good, or perhaps not the good. The subtitle of my book is The History and Promise of the Faith at Work movement. In many ways, you in this room are some of the people who'll be answering that question. What will the promise be as we look forward? It's not a new phenomena, by this way, this desire to integrate faith and work. I studied about the past 120, 130 years of it. There's 3 different waves of activity, I call them, that ebbed and flowed for a variety of reasons. Some of the other, there was motivation to start the different waves, and then with time they receded for a while. We're now in what I call wave 3. It's primarily lay-founded and lay-led. Wave 2, the ministry of the laity, was largely led by the church. But this wave, very interestingly, and part of our conversation is, well, will it continue to be that way? Is it still going to be lay-led and lay-founded? The church, writ large, by and large, with notable exceptions, many in this room, I'm sure, Tom being Exhibit A with his wonderful staff and team at his church, but by and large, with the exception of people like Tom and clergy, most clergy were either disinterested in this space, detached from it, or even dismissive. Now, in fairness to them, that to me is not a critique of the clergy, because where do clergy learn how to become clergy? In clergy factories. Seminaries, right? So if you go, in fact, again with the exception, there's some new news, but by and large, the seminaries for the past several decades have been ignoring this space. They have focused on Sunday, not Monday. And that huge gap or chasm between Sunday and Monday is what was being filled by lay men and women who wanted to connect their Sunday to their Monday. But by and large, clergy were not paying attention to it. And in fairness, it was not their fault, because the seminaries weren't teaching them or showing or telling them how to pay attention to it. The last thing I want to say as a sort of one of the highlights or takeaways maybe from God at Work 1, as I call it, GAW, God at Work, the first version, was that the movement didn't really have a language or a framework. Is it faith at work? Is it spirituality at work? Is it religion at work? What is it? What do we call it? So it needed that, and also a framework. And I've tried in my own small way, as others have as well, to give us a language to talk about it and to give us a framework. I tend to use the word faith because to me faith is an umbrella term. Everybody, 100% of the people in this world have faith. Not always a theistic faith, a faith in God, but even my atheist friends have a faith in what they could see and measure and touch and feel. So it's your worldview, or a Weltanschauung. So I like this, just like we have family-friendly policies. In some of my research I'm talking about, well, can we have faith friendly policies. And what does that look like? And how do we think about that? But spirituality, religion, those are other words you'll hear. So that's a bit of where we've come from. So where are we now? I've broken it out, as I said earlier, into external or exogenous factors to the movement and internal. And let me briefly touch on these. All of these could be the subject of an essay or a book. I guess, gee, why don't I write a book about this? There's an idea. But here are some of the external factors. First is, we all know technology, social media has changed everything we do. But in what ways as regards this movement? Well, first of all, there's new ways to convene. We don't have to always come to a hotel, even though that's as nice as this. We don't have to go to a building. We don't have to go to a place. We could do it through Zoom or Skype or any number of ways, or virtual communities which exist. Now, with these new ways to convene, that might help someone who's disabled or someone who's lonely or someone who can't get out, but it also means we do lose some of that human touch, literally as well as figuratively. So there's pluses and minuses to it. There's new distribution channels. You don't have to print newsletters or have massive mailing lists and do print media. You could do all this, the distribution channels of your content. Think of content delivery, just the sort of language that media producers will use. What's the content that's coming out of this Faith at Work movement, and how do you distribute it to people? And finally, lower barriers to entry. You could be one person sitting in the middle of Portland, Maine, and you could set up your own Faith at Work operation. And people who won't have any idea of the quality control or who you are or what your credentials are or what your story is. And other organizations will have multi-million-dollar budgets. So we're seeing, in a way, I think the lower barriers to entry is fresh and positive, but there are quality control issues. SCOTUS rulings, Supreme Court of the United States. So we've just received yesterday, the day before, the Masterpiece Cake Bakery results. But there are other ones as well that maybe aren't as common. There was a woman who worked for Abercrombie and Fitch, and she wanted to be in the retail. She was Muslim, and she wanted to wear her headscarf, and they wouldn't let her, and they fired her, and she sued, and she won. She got reinstated. So there's a number of things. There's a woman who's a software developer doing maintenance on software. She worked for a software company that made video games, arcade games. But they also made a lot of games that were very violent. Of course, we know there's a lot of violence in the gaming world. And some of that violence is against women. There's physical violence against women, which for most people of faith, that should be a horrible thing. Because if we're all created in the image of God, we shouldn't be doing horrible things in this imagery to women or anyone for that matter. She was assigned to one of the games that had this violence. And she went to her boss and said, no, I'll go on any other game you want, but I do not want to be exposed to this game. And they forced her to do it, and she sued. She won. So there's lawsuits going on. There's a British Airways flight attendant who was told she couldn't wear a tiny little discreet cross she had. She was told she couldn't wear it. So people of all different religious traditions are bumping into this question about accommodations. What does it look like? And the earlier days of the movement, you never talked about the Supreme Court. They were not involved in these decisions. It was the EEOC that was largely the adjudicator, and by and large, the legislation that guided what you could and couldn't do, or what you had to do or could not do in the workplace as regards faith, was the 1964 Civil Rights Act as amended in 1972, where people with sincerely held beliefs were allowed to practice them so long as it did not unduly disrupt the business. So long as it did not unduly disrupt the business. Well, that's changing now with Supreme Court rulings. We won't go into them all, but I just want to put that. So it's impacting the movement, and it's from the outside. So D&I, diversity and inclusion, or inclusion and diversity, based on which way to do the acronym. Fascinating space. Most large companies, and medium ones as well, as you probably know, have diversity and inclusion groups, employee resource groups or business resource groups. They're called different things. And often they are meant to help gather and support populations who have been historically discriminated against. But these are evolving and they're changing in different ways. Many people in companies are saying, well, this is interesting. If the LGBTQ group can use the conference room for a meeting at lunch, or any other group, the Asian American group or the women's group or whatever, why can't I do a Bible study or a Torah study or something at lunch? So what's going on now is many of the corporations are trying to decide if, whether, and how, and what it should look like to have a spirituality Faith at Work group. I'm involved with several companies that are doing that right now. And many are household names you wouldn't know, but they have these already. Some fly under the radar. They're not officially sanctioned, and others are actually officially sanctioned. So this is an external thing that is impacting the Faith at Work movement. Secular academics, you might think, ooh, secular people are evil. Well, hopefully you don't think that. I'm just making a joke. But many of the people doing some very solid contribution to the research and underlying thought and analysis of this faith at work phenomena are secular research scholars. So I'm at a secular research university. A good friend of mine, Faith Gunjiri, she's at Concordia College, and they have a Faith and Work Center. At the University of Arkansas School, the Walton School of Business has the Tyson Center for Faith and Work. So there's a number of these coming out, and a great body of literature coming out of the Academy of Management, which is the guild that thinks and talks about religion and what does that look like in the workplace. If you go, by the way, to the American Academy of Religion, which is the scholarly guild for theology and religion, you can hardly find a thing written about everything we're talking here. So it's, again, lay-led, lay-founded, these groups that have formed. Interesting that the scholarly community is also coming out of the management folks, the business people, not the theological people. As we all know, the composition of this country is changing due to immigration and other patterns. So it used to be, I guess I could say that because I'm in Kansas. We're not in Kansas anymore, Toto. I've been wanting to do that for years. And yeah, the population is different. The population is different. Now, personally, I think that's a wonderful thing. It's a magnificent thing. But that's also going to impact the movement and the different religious traditions and people who are coming into the movement. And finally, it's forgotten often, but people talk about globalization, but think of international travel and business. Twice this month, I'm going to be in Europe in 2 different places, and the organizations I'm going to be meeting with, one is a group of German-speaking academics who want to learn about the Faith at Work movement in the U.S., and the other is a client I do some consulting work for, and they're an international company. Every time I get on a plane and fly somewhere, whether it's to Boston or to Beijing, I sit next to someone and a conversation invariably happens. Do you remember when in the years after Christ was crucified, there was that period called the Pax Romana, the Peace of Rome? Essentially, the trade routes is how the gospel spread. It wasn't ordained clergy. It wasn't rabbis running around. It was small businessmen and women, Lydia and Priscilla and a bunch of others, who were taking the gospel around those trade routes. So many in this room, those of you who are in the marketplace, you travel as well, and you have conversations. Most of my comments today are focusing largely on the U.S., but this Faith at Work movement is exploding in other countries, and even countries that you don't think of as being sort of friendly to religion. It's exploding in China. Nika's going over to China next month, and she's going to take our integration profile and translate it into Chinese. So we're going to get data on Chinese business people and what they think about faith and work. And so it's a global business we're in now, this faith work. So those are some external factors. Now, what's internal? What's those of us who swim in this pool, and how do we think about what's going on? To me, the biggest single difference between 10 years ago, when the God at Work 1 came out, and the version which is about to come out, is it used to be if I was at a business meeting or a church and I was talking about faith at work, I would get the following reaction like, wow, you mean my work matters to God? The title of that great book, and I think the author is here somewhere. No, I'm serious. There we are. Thank you. But that was a fun, like, wow, like my work matters to God. That was powerful. Sometimes people cry to think, you mean I don't have to be a foreign missionary to serve Christ? I can actually be a ditch digger, or I could be a sales rep, or I could be a CEO or a lawyer or whatever it might be. Well, now people aren't as surprised. This movement, I think, has gained traction. A lot of folks are fully aware that work matters to God. So now people, instead of saying, wow, they're saying, how? Okay, how do I operationalize it? I don't have a lot of power. I'm junior in my company. Or I do have a lot of power. I'm the CEO. But what will people think of me? What should I do, not do? How do I operationalize it? What does it look like on the ground when I go into my office or my factory or my farmer's field or wherever I might work? Or if I work at home, what does that look like? And I think about it in 3 different tiers, self, company, and society. So what does it mean for me, David Miller, in my own work, to embody or live out faith at work teachings and concepts, those 4 different E's: ethics, experience, enrichment, and so forth, and expression? What's it look like in my company or my organization, and then the wider universe. And in some ways, I think with Made to Flourish, it looks at integration. If I recall your 4 ways of thinking about it, there's a sort of congregational life, there's the pastoral practices, there's a small group ministry, and an organizational life of the church. And then reaching beyond to help the community in which your church happens to be planted. So how do you integrate there? So I think the way that Made to Flourish thinks about it is through the lens of the pastor, and the way I'm thinking about it is through the lens of the person who's working, who's trying to figure out, how do I do this? And many people find they work for an organization which completely contravenes their faith views and how they believe they're supposed to act in the workplace. And that makes life hard, which is why for many of them the enrichment profile is what gets them through the day. Another thing, and I say this, I have been referring to as FAW, Faith at Work. That's my acronym. Well, there's this little organization called the Kern Family Foundation that some of you may have heard of, and involved in supporting many people's research in this work, my own included. And they keep putting an E at the end of it, faith, work, and economics. And I think there's a there. It's a good contribution to it, because some people, I think, have thought of faith at work just as a very personalized thing, my own personal behavior, and that's fine and good and important, because it has to start somewhere. But we do need to think about structural questions, systems questions, the environment in which we all work. So I like this addition of faith, work, and economics as a fitting together. So another thing I noticed over the past decade is there are life cycles. One of the formative game changers was a man named Howard Butt Jr. Some of you will know him. Jim, where are you? Jim, yes, we used to work for Howard Butt. And so he passed away, and his organization now is no longer really doing things for faith and work. It was one of the leading entities. Even former Vice President Gerald Ford came to one of his faith and work events as a sponsor of it, no less. So for about 30 or 40 years, that organization and Family Foundation was one of the drivers of the movement. And with all respect, they've gone on to other things. There's other organizations where men or women have died or they've retired. So this life cycle, because this movement is so founder-led, when a certain founder passes on, often that organization doesn't have a succession plan. And I don't know, frankly, as I look at it analytically as a scholar, I don't know if that's good or bad. That the Bible is full of stories of seasons and times and life cycles and harvest and weeding and planting and sowing, but that will change things. One of the big groups, the mainline churches, had something called CMDL, Coalition for Ministry and Daily Life, so Episcopalians, Methodists, Presbyterian, the whole sort of crowd of mainline churches, including Catholics as well. That group went belly up. There's very little energy in the mainline churches or resources for this sort of thing. So I ponder, and there are many groups that, and through our research, we've found hundreds of new groups. Some are very sophisticated and very large, and others they're lean. I was going to say lean and mean, but that's not what I mean. But they're lean, and they're agile, and they're getting things done. They're punching above their weight. So there's a lot of new energy and content coming out now that was not there before. There's something identified in the new version of the book I'm calling game changers. There are a few organizations who are making a difference, that are changing the whole playing field. And I've picked 3. One is the Kern Family Foundation, which I touched on briefly, with very interesting strategic funding at seminary level, at the clergy level, as many of us in this room are, and other strategic things that the way they have used their money in comparison to, say, the Lilly Foundation or others which have a traditional interest in the health and well-being of the church, what the Kern Family Foundation has done is really exceptional as far as impacting the movement. Tyson Foods, another organization, they have put in place a policy, a publicly traded company, 125,000 employees, and they strive to be faith-friendly. It's in their public documents. It's part of their mission statement to be a faith-friendly organization and to honor God in all they do. They also have chaplains on their payroll. Tyson Foods has more workplace chaplains on their payroll than some denominations do. They have 125 chaplains. And they walk around the factories. They talk to people, how you doing today? What's up? If there's an industrial accident, they're the first ones there. If someone's having a problem, hey, can I pray for you? Can I help? Essentially, they're like social workers with big hearts and the ability to pray. It's amazing. So and I'm actually working on a project looking at workplace chaplains. It's a growing phenomenon. There are now thousands and thousands of workplace chaplains around the country and also internationally as well. And the third, I mentioned Redeemer Church. I could have put Tom's church here as well, but Redeemer Presbyterian Church in New York City has done so much with Catherine, who I know is here, launching that and setting that up into play. There's so many amazing resources that they're providing, not just their church, but the globe. I was in Nashville, and the First Presbyterian Church of Nashville is using their material for something they're doing. I was in Hong Kong giving a talk at an international English-speaking church. They're also using Redeemer's materials. So the content and the resources that are out there today are just wildly improved versus a year ago. But there are these 3 or 4 organizations that are game changers and have had a disproportionate impact on the growth and flourishing of this phenomena. More and more churches are now embracing faith at work. They're still stuck, I think, on the how do I do it question, but they're starting to get it. And a lot of that, of course, is through Made to Flourish and some other organizations that are paying attention. And you'll notice I say here some seminaries are awakening via the Oikonomia Network. There are some seminaries that have been motivated to do some strategic exploration and putting courses and programs together. But relative to the overall body, I think there's about 32 or 33 that are part of the ON network, Greg, whatever the number is these days. More, 25, whatever the number is, it's hugely influential, but it's not the overall pool. And most of the bigger mainline seminaries, including my alma mater, do not pay attention to this space at all. So the external, internal things are changing the movement. Now, I also have a couple questions I want to put out, and maybe even concerns. For those of you who are leaders in this movement, who are part of it or considering and want to be active in it. The first is, what will these millennials and the Z generation as they're coming out, what do they really want? What do they care about? It may well be very different. It probably will be very different than what the baby boomers wanted. So what is that, and how do we figure that out? And how do you customize your products and services to the millennials and to the Z generation? What's the impact going to be of changing church patterns? We all know the data that there's lower and lower church attendance by all demographics, whether younger people as well as older people. Well, how will that impact the Faith at Work movement? Might some people, there's one person I know in a group I lead up in Connecticut called the Greenwich Leadership Forum. One person has sadly given up on his church, but he goes to this Faith at Work group because that's where he gets his spiritual nurturance, because they're speaking his language. So I don't know how that's going to how that will change it. I've noticed a couple Faith at Work events or gatherings or conferences I've been to where I've been a little bit uneasy, and I have to be careful of trying to have my scholarly neutrality and just my own opinions and feelings. But I've noticed some politicization in 1 or 2 meetings that I've been to. I've heard people making jokes, unkind jokes about people who are gay. Now, regardless what your theology is, not what you think, certainly to make unkind jokes should not be part of a Christian lifestyle. That concerns me. Will this Faith at Work movement get a little bit caught up in the culture wars debate? It was not in the earlier in Wave 3. It didn't seem to care about those things. It was just focusing on helping people integrate their faith and their work. So I put that out there as a question mark, a bit of a concern. Diversity, lots of ways to think about it. The movement seems to be having more gender, race, diversity than existed in the past, but still not as much as reflective of the population, the statistical representation of our country. And also, what do we even mean by that? Because in some of my research, I found that, take the Black church, for instance, that in many ways, it may not call it Faith at Work, but it's been profoundly interested in the well-being of its church members and engaging in work life for decades, for a long time. And sort of the white church is catching up, saying, oh, we ought to think about this. We shouldn't live a bifurcated life. So there's a lot to learn, I think, from the Black church. They might use some slightly different vocabulary for the phenomena, but that's another observation I've had. I've also noticed, and I would argue sadly, there's less interfaith work before. There used to be, you'd see Jewish people or spiritual but not religious, and Hindus and Christians all coming together and talking about some shared interests. Those gatherings seem to be far and few between right now. So question mark, is that good or bad? But it's empirically correct. Another question I had is, even within the movement itself, so how diverse are we? How big is the Catholic voice? How big are some of the other voices, or is it predominantly Protestant? Now, of course, we know the Acton Institute does a lot of amazing things, and they're taking more of their resources and putting them into the wider Christian community, not just the Catholic community. And what color collar do we wear? Is this just a movement for the elites? Is this just a movement for people with the disposable income? What about blue-collar people who might be working 2 or 3 jobs just to get through? They don't have time to go to a conference, yet they have many of the same issues, and perhaps even more as far as challenges of connecting their faith and their work if they're struggling to take care of a family and doing it with 2 or 3 jobs. So this gig economy, it's good for some, it's not so good for others. What will the Faith at Work movement do to think about that? And lastly, the great work we've seen with some of the current strategic gifts, will the seminaries and churches sustain this momentum? Will it become part of the blueprint? Will it become part of what it means to be a healthy church, to care about it? Will it be part of what it means to have a robust theological education, to be thinking about Monday and not just Sunday? So those are some questions I leave you with. But I don't want to depress you. This is why I'm really excited. So these are some of my students. I teach a class called Business Ethics and Modern Religious Thought. It's the fancy, what the kids, they always have nicknames for courses. They call it How to Succeed Without Selling Your Soul. Now, and the course is sold out. It's crazy. It's about 175 people in this class of all different religious traditions, and you could even see visually different countries, different nationalities, different ethnicities. And essentially, it's a faith and work course. We're talking about faith and work the whole time and looking at these different traditions to say, what are the resources that are out there? So if you're Jewish, be a really good Jew. If you're Christian, be a really good Christian. Look at your teachings to help you consider how you ought to engage in the workplace. Now, by the way, they don't look too happy in this photo, and they're not, because it's their midterm exam. But I have there's a lot of crazy things about our beloved millennials and the Zs, but if there's nothing else that is really exciting, is they want to live an integrated life. They have no time for what their parents and grandparents did, as having a bifurcated compartmentalized life. They want to bring their whole self to work, messy though that sometimes can be, and that includes their spirituality. Here's another reason I get excited, and I had to put this up, Tom, to embarrass you, but this is from 10 years ago, and it's even a prototype of the integration profile. I called it a box back then, and this is when Tom and his church did a 4-part series, or 5 parts over one of each of the 4 Sundays, looked at one of the different E's, and then I came out, I think, at the end, but they converted their sanctuary into a cubicle, an office cubicle, and that's where Tom would preach from that. Isn't that? But the most visual, symbols matter in a church. And to turn a church into an office space with a cubicle, I thought it was brilliant. It was up for the whole month. And my last slide that I leave you with, this is from Germany. There's an international church in Bonn, Germany. Look carefully. What does it say above the door? Servants' entrance. And it's above the door going out of the church. We're entering into the world to serve. We're entering into the world to serve. And our workplaces, I believe, are one of the most profound, significant, and societally changing parts of Christian life if we would only but roll up our sleeves and engage. With that, I thank you all.